Hi, I'm Rabbi Jeremy from Mahar, and this is Parshat Re'eh, our third Torah portion for August 2020. So we looked at Vayet Hanan, we looked at Akev, and now we're looking at Re'eh. Parshat Re'eh kind of continues some of the theological discussions that we've had before. Blessing and curse, what the consequences are for violating the sacrifices. But we also start to get something that's very unique, very specific to Deuteronomy out of the Torah. The other books of the Torah talk about laws for sacrifice. What they don't do is they don't talk about the idea of a fixed place of worship once people arrive into the land. This is very much part of Deuteronomy's agenda. The book of Deuteronomy's agenda includes beefing up the legitimacy of a centralized sacrificial cult for Israelite religion in a specific place. And the specific place, from the Deuteronomist's perspective, again, this group of people that generated these texts, the Deuteronomists, the place to do this, to have this kind of worship, is Jerusalem. We actually know they mean Jerusalem in part because there's another version of this text preserved by the Samaritans. And you maybe have heard of the Good Samaritan. So Jews did not view Samaritans kindly. Samaritans were apparently, maybe were people who were left behind during some of the exiles. It's really not 100% clear. They have a version of the Torah, and their version of the Torah actually says something different than Deuteronomy in all of these places where Deuteronomy says, in the place I will choose to put my name. This is the circumlocution that the text of Deuteronomy uses to mean Jerusalem. The Samaritans have a version of Deuteronomy that actually says Mount Gerizim, which is where Samaritan cultic worship was and continues to be centered in the modern state of Israel. So we know they're talking about Jerusalem because there's a counter text tradition that says, no, Mount Gerizim, you guys have it wrong in your Torah. But we're starting to get discussion of the place I choose to put my name. And this is distinct to the book of Deuteronomy. This is new for the Torah. So we get discussion of offering sacrifices in a specific place. And there's a reason for this in this spot, which is we're now talking about kashrut a little bit. So we're talking about sacrifices and the idea that people were supposed to give a portion of their meat to the temple, to the tabernacle in the wilderness. Otherwise, they weren't supposed to eat meat. We're now getting the idea that, if you live far away from the temple, you don't have to do this. This is, as I mentioned from the prior video, there are ways that biblical scholars date texts based on past events. And this is another one of those ways that biblical scholars have put this text after the Babylonian exile has occurred, because why would you be eating so far from the temple? Well, here's why. There's no temple and you're outside the land of Israel. So this legitimizes eating meat, and it legitimizes giving tithes in the form of money instead of in the form of produce or other food when people live too far away from the temple. It's really, really useful to know from a historical perspective that by the time we get to the period of the Babylonian exile, the only people who are really centrally located that we identify as predecessors to Jews are really only living in Jerusalem. There's not much that they control. So it's weird that you'd be far away from the temple, unless you're in exile. Some people don't come back from exile, and this legitimizes their eating of meat. It legitimizes people who are eating meat in exile as well. They don't have to share if you're too far away. Send a tithe. Just send money. So we have this awareness of the problem of eating meat, and this is another way that we date this thing to after the Babylonian exile. We also have a lot of discussion of what will become kashrut. And this is repetition in most respects from other parts of the Torah, where we've got discussion of don't eat pork, fins and scales for fish, no birds of prey, no scavenger birds, animals that chew their cud and have cloven hooves that live on the ground but nothing else, don't eat bats. These are some of the rules of kashrut. Also, don't eat an animal that you found dead in the street or lying on the ground, essentially. And then it says, but you can sell those to the stranger who lives with you. So they can deal in the business of it, but they can't eat those animals. We also get a little bit of a calendar. So we get Passover, Shavuot, which is 50 days after Passover begins, and Sukkot. And Sukkot is not given a great fixed spot in the calendar. It says 7 days after the grain is gathered, which could be kind of anywhere. This is not a very good way of fixing the date for Sukkot, but it's what we have in this particular part of the Torah. The other thing we have is discussion of sabbatical years. A release of people who are in debt, a release of people who were made to be indentured servants. Israelite slaves are considered to be kind of indentured servants. They're not permanently fixed with the family as chattel slaves, unless they want to be, and there's an option for that. But we assume that most people didn't. We also have to kind of assume that since Deuteronomy is the only text that talks about this whole year of Jubilee release kind of thing, sabbatical years and the Jubilee years, we really have to assume these events didn't happen. These release years didn't happen. That what Deuteronomy is doing is trying to express the idea that people shouldn't be poor, that economic matters should somehow be set to rights every so often. There's no indication that this was followed. We really don't have a lot of information about how Jewish society functioned between the end of the closing out of the Tanakh and the Greco-Roman period. We're missing a lot of information. We really can't assume that sabbatical years happened. We don't have mention of sabbatical years happening in a lot of other Jewish texts subsequent to this. So this maybe is an idealization of a thing that doesn't really occur. In which case we really have a difficult time dating this particular section of the Torah exactly, right? So little bits and pieces of the Torah get dated at different times. We don't really know when this comes from, but it doesn't really seem very likely that this rule was followed in its full extent. The best indication we have that any part of it was followed is the release of debt every 7 years, because Rabbi Hillel, who is famous from the Talmud and elsewhere, 600 years after the Babylonian exile, more or less, will enact something called the Prozbul, Prozbul, and the Prozbul basically says, okay, all those debts, all those loans that you make in the 6th year right before the sabbatical year that maybe you're not going to get paid back for, we're going to do this thing where you sell them into the court and we're going to enable the debt to continue because people weren't loaning money. Israelites already aren't supposed to loan money at interest to one another, and now you don't get paid back at all. Too much of a risk. People weren't lending money. So this was what Hillel did to work around this problem. But we have very little other information that suggests that the Prozbul, that the sabbatical years were followed through, probably in large part because by the time anybody is trying to do these things, by the time Deuteronomy is written, Israelites don't control their land anymore. So there are no ancestral lands that were carved up to be reallocated. So it seems very likely that most of this didn't happen, but maybe that the sabbatical year release of debt specifically did occur. So that's Parshat Re'eh. We have 2 more left for August, Parshat Shoftim and Parshat Ki Teitzei.